Thank you. It's so great to be in front of you folks in particular. I'm usually doing my programs for the public at large who are kind of learning about Wyatt Earp. But you're going to have some good questions and some good rebuttals, I'm sure. So please feel free to speak up. I am not by any means a psychologist or a psychiatrist or any kind of analyst. So the only thing I can tell you that gives me permission to do a program like this is that I've been studying Wyatt Earp for 68 years in a very serious manner. And it was inevitable that I would write about him because writing is my passion. A lot of people have been asking me questions about why did you write historical fiction? I have no interest in trying to outdo Casey Tiefertiller or anybody else who's done some very fine work. And in fact, Casey's book kind of served as my outline in a way, gave me a timeline, good one. But I'm a novelist at heart, and I wanted to expand this story, make it more colorful and present dialogues and reveal motives and emotions. And a historian just cannot do that. You know, that's the law, really. But a historical novelist can do that. But I want you to know I have based all of my trilogy on the best information that I know. Only one person in that book is fictional. That's kind of rare with historical fiction. Just as a point of clarification, the paperbacks are out and the publisher decided to put new titles on it. Figure that one out. So don't let that throw you. It's a little embarrassing because what if people say, oh, look, he's got 3 more books out now. How about those too? Then they're reading along. They say, I think I've been here before. So please know that those are the same books, just with different titles. I think, I consider myself a literary writer, not a blood and thunder writer. And I think my original titles were a little bit too literary for them. They wanted titles that definitely showed off, this is going to be a Western. To understand Wyatt Earp is quite a task. As I told you, many decades of study, but only about maybe 15 years ago, a dozen years ago, did I really get it. I had not understood him and for a long time because I first started my study of him when I was very young, and I was in a family dynamic in which fear was part of that house. It was an unhealthy kind of relationship, but it made me interested in courage. I felt some fear. I wanted to know how to overcome that. So the first book that I picked up was Frontier Marshal by Stuart Lake. And of course, that is a story about a man with tremendous courage, right? We now know it's highly fictionalized, but it had a huge effect on me, a profound one. So let's get into a little about him. He's the most controversial figure, I believe, in the American West. Other people who have controversies, maybe it's about one thing, you know, but with Wyatt Earp, it's about dozens of things. Did they happen or did they not? So once those glamorizing books had come out, then there was a slew of debunking books. And for someone like me to suddenly read that as a boy, it just threw me for a loop. So that made it more difficult for me to understand. So let me get into Wyatt. In the last decade of his life, he and his wife were poor. And they basically lived off the generosities of friends and family. I'm certain that Wyatt must have felt some kind of need to arrange things better for Sadie, his wife, because he knew he would die before she, and he wanted to leave her behind with some security. What did he have? What could he do to do that? He figured that his greatest asset was his story. And so he saw an opportunity. The film industry was booming. The Western was the thing. This was one of the greatest Western movie stars, William S. Hart. But his star was starting to fade. But he met Wyatt Earp. He wanted to meet Wyatt Earp. He idolized Wyatt Earp. He idolized the men who actually played the real parts in reality that he was playing on celluloid. And so he made it a point to meet Wyatt Earp and befriend him. And it became a good friendship. Wyatt wanted it originally, I am sure, because he always was on a mission to rise up into the higher echelon of society and be well thought of by people who were respected. And this was one of those opportunities. But it actually grew into a good friendship. So he hoped that Mr. Hart could, with his pull, and he still had pull in Hollywood, he could talk a producer or director into doing a film on Wyatt's life. He was completely unsuccessful with it. Nobody ever speaks about why that is, and I have a hunch that it might have been about Wyatt's name, that word Earp. That's an odd one, isn't it? It might not look good on the marquee, but for whatever reason, Hart failed at his task, so he came back to Wyatt and said, here's what we need to do. You need to write a book first. Once everybody sees what your life is, all the movie producers are going to want to make the movie then. So this is where this young man comes in. John Flood is a young engineer, a neighbor of the Earps, and he basically offers himself as the secretary for these two elderly people. And he handles all kinds of things for them, you know, accounts and taxes, things of that sort. When Wyatt mentions this thing about writing a book, well, Flood is willing to do it. He knows he's not a writer, and he's going to find out later he's even worse than that. He's a terrible writer. But he's willing to do it, and so they begin the book, and I'm sure everybody in here has seen a copy of that book. You read it and you understand why it didn't go over. Not only did he get rejection letters, he got disparaging letters. One of them in particular, where a woman editor in a publishing company said, "You'll never get this book published." So what to do? Fate brings this man to Wyatt Earp's door. This is Walter Noble Burns. He has just come off of a huge success with his book, The Saga of Billy the Kid. It's nationally famous, and now he's looking for his follow-up book, wants to do it on the West, so he hopes to do it on Wyatt. He asked Wyatt if he can do his story, write it. Now, what I'm about to tell you tells you a lot about one side of Wyatt Earp. Wyatt said, "Thank you, but I've already got somebody doing it." Now that would be like Ang Lee, Ron Howard, Martin Scorsese walking up to your door and asking, "Can I do a movie of your life?" And you say, "No, my neighbor's already doing a Super 8 film of me. It'll do just fine." He was loyal. That was a quality of his that shows up many times in his life. So Burns, I'm sure, is disappointed, but Wyatt says, "What I can do is offer you this idea. Why don't you write about Doc Holliday? And I'll be your advisor on it." Of course, Doc Holliday's long dead by now. So Burns says, "Sounds good. I'll go do that, and I'll be in touch." Well, the book came out, and Wyatt Earp was very distressed. It wasn't about Doc Holliday at all. It was about Wyatt Earp in Tombstone. Wyatt felt like his most valuable asset had been hijacked. This is a shot of the rear entrance of the OK Corral. That gate way down there at the end, that's the rear entrance. So this is the alleyway that people walk through. This is the way that the cowboys walked out to get over to the vacant lot by Flies. See the gate down there? I'm going to jump ahead so you can look at that bottom left picture. That's Walter Burns also. He's standing just inside that gate. That's Bowers Meat Market there that you see with the sloped roof. You know why he's standing there? The citizens of Tombstone brought him there and said, this is where the fight was. So that's where we get that mix-up of the OK Corral versus Fly's Alley. Wyatt, I'm sure, is soured on writers by now. But another man knocks on his door, Stuart Lake. Now here's the connection. This is how it happened. Stuart Lake was the PR man for Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was very much like William S. Hart in that he wanted to get to know these old-time lawmen. He just admired them so much. So he struck up a friendship with Bat Masterson, you know, who had moved to the East. And so Stuart Lake met Bat Masterson. And Stuart says to Masterson, I want to write the big book on the West. Maybe I could write your story. Now, what Masterson replied just floors me because I feel like I know Bat Masterson too. And I would have thought he would have said, well, let's get started. But he said, if you really want to know the West, you got to talk to Wyatt Earp. And Wyatt won't talk. And what that means is Wyatt Earp was one of the most laconic people probably to ever be on the planet. But Lake is encouraged by John Flood. Flood is begging Wyatt, let him write it. He probably didn't want one more rejection letter. And Flood generously offered all of his notes to Lake. Lake took them. And Lake was a good researcher. He contacted a lot of people, and he traveled and met them. And he came out with the book that I first picked up. And you know how often we think of all this as way back in the past? I picked up this book 23 years after it was published. You know, little comparisons like that really bring it home to you about it wasn't that long ago. My mom was 10 years old when Wyatt Earp died. That just kind of puts it into a different perspective. That book hooked me in a huge way. But look at the date. Wyatt died in 1929, and the book came out in 31. And this means that Lake had plenty of time to do whatever he wanted to do to the book. And boy, did he embellish it. He turned it into a piece of fiction, and he gave us the most quintessential courageous hero who ever rode across the prairie. And he showed us a man of high moral values. As we get into the true study of Earp, we know how untrue that is. But at that time in my life, this was more than a book to me. This was kind of like a guideline for me. And it meant so much to me. I can't express how much. Some of the things that Lake did it was almost like a Forrest Gump, you know, where he would just have Wyatt placed into all kinds of scenarios. For example, meeting Jim Bridger as a boy when he's crossing with the wagon train in 1864 to California. Well, that didn't happen. Another was eventually giving Wyatt the buntline special. Anybody out there that cringes now when I tell you there was no buntline special, in my opinion, believe me, I was the hardest one to swallow that one. I was in love with that gun. I had already bought, you know, Colt came out with a commemorative model of a .22 caliber Colt Frontier buntline special. Came in a black case with red velvet lining. Boy, I've still got that box. And I think also that Lake was very sly and dishonest. I believe that he wrote letters to people just to get down in ink papers that he could show later that backed up his fictions. For example, he wrote the Colt Company about the buntline. He wrote Mrs. Earp about the buntline. He wrote to Ed Hoaxie, Charlie Hoaxie. Was it Charlie? or Ed Hoaxie up in Alaska. Mr. Hoaxie, how about that? He wrote him wanting to get that Buntline special for himself. I believe that was all just make-believe to get it down on record. Well, I wrote to all these people, so that would make people believe it was true. So this was a mythology. But when Wyatt Earp, the life and legend of Wyatt Earp, premiered on TV as the first adult Western, that's what they called it, Tuesday night, 8:30, Channel 11, where I lived. It was the one show I was allowed to watch every week. Did you notice that after that show, everybody needed their own Excalibur? Think of the rifleman. What did he have? Think of Steve McQueen and Wanted Dead or Alive. What did he have? Does anybody remember Johnny Ringo, the TV show? He had a LeMat special, which shot rounds of .45 caliber and then a shotgun load underneath that barrel. All gimmicks. Stuart Lake got this started, I believe. So where's Wyatt Earp in the big, big picture of history? He doesn't belong in a textbook anywhere. He didn't do anything like a Meriwether Lewis or a Mark Twain or a Levi Strauss. Why is he so famous? Well, because of this little alley right here. Here's another view of that from an artist. This is the alleyway where the Earps met the cowboys. Why is this so famous? You and I have seen probably hundreds of movies where two men stand in the street and come toward each other, face each other, guns holstered. Maybe words are spoken, and then moment of truth comes. You know how often that happened in real life, right? You do. Most people don't. This is one of those rare occasions. It's just like Hickok and Tut in Springfield, Missouri. It is so rare for that to happen. That's why this is so famous. 30 seconds, and that's the basis of Wyatt Earp's fame. Let's see what kind of a man this is from the start. Probably it can be said the first real influence you have is your parents. We don't know a lot about Virginia Earp, but we certainly can draw some conclusions about her because she married Nicholas Earp. She was 19. Nicholas had already married, had a son, and he remarried 1 year later. He was 19, she was 19, he was 27. Now here's what's known about Nick. I'm going to give you some phrases that have been said about him. Blustery, opinionated, violent, bombastic, liked to be in control. When they traveled in a wagon train to California, Nicholas Earp was not going to follow anybody. He was the wagon master. And one of the families in that, the Rousseau family, the mother left a diary about that experience. If you want to know Nicholas Earp, read that diary. He was hard to stomach. Very political, a proponent of duty. He had a patriotic side. Very clannish, full of wanderlust. And he liked to be seen on the side of the law. But if it suited him, if he could get away with it, he was fine with breaking the law. Every photo I've ever seen of Nicholas Earp, he glowers at the camera or at the cameraman. What's it like to grow up under a domineering father like that? I feel, in my layman's career as an analyst, there are three ways to go. I feel like I know these well because at one time they were pertinent to me. If you have a dictatorial father, do you, one, fall in line and obey like a soldier? Well, Wyatt certainly did that to a degree. After all, he was assigned 80 acres of corn that was his to manage. 80 acres, folks. Think about that a moment. And to make matters worse, they gave him his two younger brothers to help him, Morgan and Warren, who were always fighting. Number two, under a dictatorial father, do you rebel? There was some of that. There was at least one occasion where Wyatt stood up to his father like that. Probably had to be much more than that. Number three, turn inward and become very much more introverted with your thoughts. You take counsel with yourself rather than your father. You learn your own self-esteem by your own measure. You don't try to please your father anymore. That's fruitless. So Wyatt, I believe, had a combination of, to some degrees, of all three. Here's a picture of Wyatt at 21, and I've got listed above him some of the occupations that he undertook. Now, like I said, he wasn't someone who contributed greatly to American history, but look at these occupations. It's a rich cross-section of what was going on to build America. And he was the soldier who helped make that happen. Every renowned architect has got to have his bricklayer, right? Every railroad magnate has got to have his spike driver, right? So the common people, they are really the sinew of the story of our history, who follow through with the dreams of the people who come up with the great ideas. Gary Roberts often refers to Wyatt as a foot soldier. I think that's a good term. Now this is the part I was really looking forward to because I'm with you today. I've had this thing gnawing at me for a long, long time. I want you to have a look. That's Bill Tillman on the left. And that's Wyatt on the right, of course. The photo in the center was published by Zoe Tillman, Bill Tillman's second wife. Now, keep in mind that when they married, she was 22 and he was almost 50. So I ask you this, is it possible that a woman who comes into a man's life in that situation with that age difference, is it possible she might not know him at age 16, which this is supposed to be? Or is this a picture of Wyatt Earp at age, what would he be there? 19, I believe. No, it would have been more than that. Wyatt was 6 years older than Tillman. What do you think? I'd love to hear your ideas. Look at those faces. I feel like that's Wyatt Earp. You know, those friends back then exchanged pictures. That's one of the reasons that Billy the Kid tintype, got surfaced. I think there's a good chance that is Wyatt. At that age where you see Wyatt now, he returns back east to Missouri on a letter from his father. His father has settled in Lamar, Missouri, and Nicholas is the constable there. That's kind of like a low-level peace officer, but it was the only one there. And he wants Wyatt to come back there and take over that job because Nicholas wants to be justice of the peace. Wyatt does that. He comes back, and here's a watershed moment for him because now we have a Wyatt Earp who marries, there's Orilla, his wife. He's going to be a father. He buys a house. He wears a badge for the first time. But she dies. And that's the next watershed moment. Because from there, Wyatt falls into a very, very dark place. He leaves Missouri with debts behind him. He's actually taken money from the city coffers. And you know what? I'm betting that there's a rationalization that went on in his mind. Because he's human. That's what humans do. They rationalize their actions. He goes into the Indian Territory, and the next time we hear of him, he's been arrested on federal land for horse theft. He and a man named Kennedy were arrested together. In addition to, there was a man and wife traveling with him, and the man was arrested also. No one knows how this worked. No one. So there are probably a dozen different ways you could spin this story as to how it happened. We don't know who actually stole the horses. There were definitely stolen horses. Was it this man who was with his wife, John Schoen? Because when they went to jail, Mrs. Schoen told the police, "Do not let my husband be in the same cell with Earp, because Earp will kill him." And what's that all about? Could that be that Schoen is the one most responsible? We'll just never know all that. But how this works out is, the men in the cell next to Wyatt have been working on the ceiling, and they break through one night finally. They get up into the crawl space above and then bust their way out of the top of the jail. And now the ones in Wyatt's cell get busy doing that too. They're inspired. And so there's an exodus coming out of that jail. And Wyatt gets out, but his friend Kennedy does not. Could that be because he couldn't fit through the hole? Or could it be that, no, I'm going to sit here and take my chances because I'm innocent? All we know is that Kennedy was acquitted eventually, which probably means that Wyatt would have been acquitted. Wyatt didn't know all this. He took off a wanted man. Where did he go? One of the worst places you could imagine. I would have gone out in the wide open West. He went to Peoria. The Illinois riverfront was a sordid and seedy place, full of brothels. And Wyatt was employed in at least 3 different brothels there. Was arrested several times. Got his name in the paper as the Peoria Pimp. As to whether he pimped or not, literally, no one can tell us. We don't know. But he was definitely an enforcer. That would be a bouncer today. And was he made for that job? I would think so. And here's why. He's tough, he's confident, and he's big. Do I look big to you? I'm exactly his dimensions, 6 feet tall, about 165 pounds. But in those days, the average man, 5, 6, or 7, 135 pounds. So he was big. And his state of mind was the main thing. All of the Earps had this, I believe, all the Earp males. I don't know about the females. But they were scrappers. They did not know quit. Another reason that Wyatt was well suited for this job, when he worked on the railroad, he got beaten up so badly in a fight by a big, brutish Swede rail worker that an Irishman named John Chauncey must have taken pity on him. Might have liked him too, who knows? But he decided to take him under his wing and teach Wyatt the art of fighting. And so he did. And before Wyatt left that railroad camp, he got his retributions against that Swede. Giving up on this life after a time, which must have been very wearing on him. But who knows? Was it the perfect place for him at this time? And beating up people, was that the right thing for him at this time? Lashing out at what fate had done to him by taking away his plan? Just think about that plan. Had that plan come to fruition with Orilla, would we even know of Wyatt Earp today? Probably not. So he goes out west to buffalo hunt, our great symbol of the American West, and also a reminder of one of the worst slaughters that we've ever engaged in. But this was an opportunity, and if you had lived back then, there are probably people in this room who would have elected to be a buffalo hunter. There were 30 million of them on the plains. 30 million. Within about a decade and a half, there were only about 300. 30 million to 300. So it looked like it was an endless business you could get into. It was a big business mostly because of the Industrial Revolution and all of the grinding cogs and wheels and the belts that were needed to run those. And the buffalo hide made an excellent belt. And there was a great demand for this in the East and in Europe. Buffalo robes were even in demand in Europe. You could get in those days about $3.50 for a hide. Now, if you translate that into our currency today, you're talking $80 a hide. That'd be pretty enticing, wouldn't it, to go into that line of work? But you had to be tough. It was a tough life, messy, bloody, gory. Once the slaughter had come to its end, or was heading that way, the prairie now made room for a new beast, another great symbol of the American West, the longhorn, brought here by the Spanish conquistadors. And some just got loose, some were stolen, but they became feral animals. And during the Civil War, when the men left to go fight in the East, these animals just proliferated. In Texas alone, there were estimated to be 5 million longhorns, all wild. So this gives rise to the American cowboy, who borrowed all his skills from the Mexican vaquero. It's the beginning of the American legend, isn't it? The American cowboy is probably at heart our idea of the quintessential American, male at least. After the Civil War, when these men came home, somebody saw an opportunity. If they could get this beef to the East to feed all those numbers there, they could make a fortune. Now, how to get them there? That would require another beast, this one made of iron. The railroad, the first railroad, the transcontinental, had gone through Nebraska. But branches and spurs were being sent south, and everywhere that one came down and became a railhead where it ended, that was the target for the cattlemen to drive cattle to that place so that they could get them on the railroad. They sent them back east live, and then they were slaughtered in Chicago and cut up and then sold and shipped. All of the railheads became famous because they were cow towns. First big one was Abilene, where Hickok was. And then coming due south from there, you've got Newton and Wichita, and then Caldwell, and then a southwestern branch coming down hits Ellsworth, and then the famous Dodge City. So each one of them had their heydays. But who was it that was going to take these people, these steers, north? Let's talk about them a moment, because this bears some consideration. Ex-soldiers. They had already, out of necessity, crossed that line that every soldier has to cross. Changes you forever. Where you can kill pretty mindlessly. If it's the enemy, you can kill. That mindset can create a very dangerous person. The other people in this drive were the ones who were too young to have gone to the war. And so they have something to prove to these vets. So you've got these two different categories that are pretty volatile when you think about it. And they're going to drive for 3 months. They're going to drive herds north to Kansas. They're making river crossings. They're experiencing stampedes. electrical storms. They're eating dust. They're living in the saddle all the time. They get $1 a day for that job. So at the end of the trail, they got $90 in their pocket. This creates this really unique, let's call it a crucible, where things are going to happen that create the Old West that probably got you interested in it. And I'm talking here about the rowdy Texans who brought in the herds into the town, and now it's, by God, I'm going to celebrate time, and nobody's going to stop me. Texans, any Texans in the room? Just so I can know which direction the boots might be coming from. And I believe, you can't say that today because, everywhere is such a mix of people, but Texans had a certain attitude. It probably has something to do with the Alamo and San Jacinto and the fact that Texas was a republic before it was a state. But there's an attitude there, and here's proof of it. You know how some people put bumper stickers on their car to kind of celebrate their state? In my state, I'm from Georgia. It's Georgia on my mind. In Oregon, it's we like it here. You might too. Here in Arizona, the Grand Canyon State. California, bump sticker. Dream big. Texas. Don't mess with Texas. So these men, when they come into town, these Texans, first thing they want to do is get a bath. A warm bath. Or let's say a hot bath. Then they want new clothes. They want anything other than the color of dust. They like the bright colored clothes, fancy clothes. Then they go to the saloons to get the alcohol. And there's the gambling going on. So it's all there in this mix, this attitude, and alcohol especially, and guns. All of this creates this very fragile little balance that's about to be talked about here. And keep in mind that all these Texans, virtually all these Texans are Democrats. Virtually all these Northerners are Republicans. So you've got that clash too. Grievances from the Civil War lasted. They're still there in Georgia. I don't know how they are in other places, but they still exist. So what kind of man does it take to fill the boots of a peace officer in a place like that, where the merchants have got to have that business to stay alive? They depend on the spring cattle drives and through the summer for their livelihood. And if that was shut off, like it happened in some towns, those towns really became humble very quickly. Hello? That's not for me. That was my way of saying, turn that thing off. How would a Texan have said that? It took someone who was tough, who could face danger and still feel confidence. You had to be physically able to handle a man. And that pretty much defines Wyatt Earp right there. A lawman, in many ways, had to be much like an outlaw. You know the word desperate that you hear a lot? You know what that really means when you read in the newspapers, he was a desperate man? There's a language to the Old West that modern people don't understand. That means you're willing to kill someone. You can do it. You know what a hog ranch is, right? Hog ranch? Nobody? It's a brothel. It's a prostitute establishment. You don't go there for bacon, something else. But you had to have a desperate man, and that's what lawmen and outlaws were. Had to be willing to kill. First time in the West that Wyatt is said to have taken this job. That this is a controversial point, but I'm going to go through it because there's some rationale that might convince you that it could have happened. Ellsworth was one of those big cattle towns. Wyatt drifted into there in late summer of '73. And at that time in the nation, we were experiencing our first big economic depression. There was not much incentive for Texans to go back to Texas. So here, and take a look at this plaza. This shot is taken, I think, from the railroad embankment. You can just see the shadow of the embankment at the bottom right corner. So you've got an additional space on the backside too. That's the plaza. The plaza will come into play later. Some of these Texans who are here include these two men who now say they are Texans. They're from England. Ben Thompson and his brother Billy. They both have reputations. Billy's the more dangerous of the two because he's an alcoholic and he's drunk almost all the time. Ben has a reputation too as a more serious, desperate man. They are gambling in a saloon with the lawmen. And the lawmen are the only men in town who are allowed to carry guns. So think about that for a minute at the gambling table. Well, the Thompsons accuse the lawmen of cheating. They have no recourse because they don't have guns on them. So they turn the table over and storm out of there and walk across the plaza to the hotel and get their guns. Wyatt Earp's in town now. He's not involved in this little altercation, but he's in a local store, Beeb's General Store, and when all of this opens up, the Thompsons come out with their guns and they start yelling for the lawmen to come out. Most of them, I believe, have already snuck out of town. One of them steps out from the corner of a building and shots are exchanged. So there's a time here where the Thompsons don't know who's in that saloon and who's not. But they've got the town in their hands now. It's what you call treeing a town. Of course, you know this. And somebody sent for the one good lawman in the area, and that was the county sheriff, Ellsworth County Sheriff Chauncey Whitney. He had a good reputation. He knew the Thompsons. He was interrupted from a picnic with his wife. He came into town. He came up to Ben Thompson and said, "Boys, let's turn this down a bit. Let me buy you boys a drink. We'll go inside and talk about it. If the lawmen here, the police force, were in the wrong, we'll talk about that." So he really did diffuse the situation. And as they're walking into the saloon, it is said that Billy stumbles and the shotgun goes off, and Chauncey Whitney is shot mortally. He's going to die very soon. How can that be an accidental hit? You got to cock that shotgun. Maybe he had cocked it already beforehand. Those are the kind of details we'll just never know. But now, Billy Thompson has murdered. So they get Billy onto a horse. They have to hold him up there. They probably had to tie him in. They got him out of town. And now Ben and the rest of the Texans are holding the town at bay. They're daring anybody to come out there and take their guns from them. And the town is all now hiding inside of stores, and the mayor goes inside Beeb's store where Wyatt Earp is. And we don't know how this went. According to Stuart Lake, Wyatt made some comment about, "Fine town you got here." And the mayor turned to him and said something like, "Well, what would you do?" And Wyatt said, "I'd go out there and take their guns from them." Now that sounds really far-fetched, but it does illustrate one phrase that I think belongs to Wyatt Earp. I think of him as a straight-ahead man. When he saw something that needed to be done, he just moved toward it in a straight line. Virgil was the same way. So Wyatt accepts that badge just for that moment. And what he's supposed to do is take a message out there from the mayor saying, "The mayor will fix this so Ben doesn't have to worry. He'll just make it disturbing the peace." This is after the sheriff has been murderously shot. So Wyatt puts on a gun and walks out there. And that right there, just doing that, this is the first thing that got me in this book. Walking out that door, walking into that plaza that you saw, crossing those tracks, talking to these men. Ben Thompson didn't know Wyatt Earp, and yet he walks out there alone. That says something. Now, it wasn't a dramatic showdown like Stuart Lake portrays it, probably. But Wyatt delivers the message, and who knows what else happened there. So many times people talk about the look of Wyatt Earp when talking to people, when he's on a mission. And it's formidable. That could have come into play. But Thompson drops the gun. So then the mayor comes out, and, he's all smiles. Says, "Come on, Ben, I'll take you down to the courthouse." And one of the officers who's still in town picks up the shotgun, and they go down to the courthouse. And so now things are defused, minus one life. And Wyatt goes to the place where he's staying. He's packing up to go. And the mayor wants him to stay on as the town marshal. Wyatt hands the badge back. And according to Lake, he says, "I don't believe your town's big enough for me if you rate the life of a lawman at $25, because that's all they charge Ben Thompson." So he basically gave the mayor a metaphorical slap in the face and moved on from there. So he moves to Wichita, and I'll go briefly through some of these face-offs that just include more straight-ahead movement by Wyatt Earp. Wichita, to my mind, marks the time in Wyatt's life when he decides to try for a higher level of social standing. His brother is already firmly entrenched in prostitution here. He and his wife run a brothel in Wichita. And most certainly, James has asked Wyatt to be an enforcer there. He's got the experience, but Wyatt doesn't do that. He's after something else, but he doesn't know what it is. The marshal of Wichita sees Wyatt on the street. This is backed up by a deputy that this happened. He walks up to Wyatt and asks him if he'd like to be a deputy, a part-time deputy called a special, just on image alone, on the way he looked. That says something about Wyatt Earp there. So he took that and he went on duty when called. Eventually he became a regular deputy. But on one occasion he came down hard on the Texans, and the Texans went back to their trail boss and complained. And this trail boss was Manon Clements, a man whose name was known around the West as being a formidable man to deal with. And so Clements is bringing, the word gets out in Wichita that Clements is bringing his crew over from the cow camp, which is on the other side of Delano, which is the sister city of Wichita, across the Arkansas River here. This is the only way they can come across this bridge, and you can see the width of it. So the marshal and special deputies and regular deputies and volunteer citizens all come down to this end of the bridge, because this would be the place, to use a bottleneck for an advantage. And as the man in Clements brings his men over, there's a moment of hesitation there on the part of Marshal Billy Smith. And Wyatt does not want man in Clements to see that hesitation, and he steps forward. He's going to be the spokesperson. And so I'm sure Clements had a lot to say. I don't believe it happened the way that Lake wrote it. But Wyatt said one short thing, which probably did happen. He said, "You've got a lot more men than we do. If this opens up, a lot of men are going to die, but you're going to be the first." The Clements crowd folded in on itself and went back across the bridge, and the incident was done. Another incident. There was a man named Anthony Cook. He joined the U.S. Army, was court-martialed, thrown out. He probably was the kind of guy who just couldn't make it on his own to do any kind of work. So he changed his name and joined the Army again. This time he called himself Melvin King. His highest rank he ever achieved was corporal. But when he quit the Army finally, it seems like he quit the Army simply to be a troublemaker in the West. That's what it looks like when you look at his record. He called himself Sergeant King. Well, we all know who Sergeant King was, right? Of the Yukon. Anyway, in Wichita, he stood in the middle of the street and he dared any lawman to come take his guns away from him. Well, Wyatt Earp was on duty as a regular policeman at that time. He walked a straight line to him. He had help. Jimmy Cairns, deputy, was behind him with a scattergun. But Wyatt was the one to walk out to that man. And how did that go? You know, you can only imagine it. There's a guy holding his guns, and Wyatt's walking out with holstered guns. He walks out there and takes the guns away from the man and drags him to jail by his ear. We don't have a picture of Sergeant King to show you. That's a picture of Wyatt about that age. This is actually taken in Dodge City, but it's close to what he looked like, I'm sure. But what I love about this story is that Stuart Lake didn't get it from Wyatt. He got it from an attorney who lived in Wichita, and he told him the whole story. And the attorney said, it was the nerviest thing I ever saw. And so Stuart Lake got back to Wyatt and said, did this really happen? Wyatt said, forgot about that. Wyatt moves on to Dodge City, and now right away he's appointed assistant marshal. That's really the front man in law enforcement, in the town police. The job of marshal in this case, and especially in this case because of who the marshal was, is a huge man. Wyatt was the head enforcer, so to speak. And here he had to learn that balance of not being so rough on the Texans so that their merchants there would still have their business. But Wyatt wasn't good at that. The one compensation he could allow was that he would hit them over the head with his gun, buffalo them, instead of shoot them. And when you think about that, that's a chancy thing to do, because there's that time element of raising your gun up and swinging it down when another man could be pulling his gun on you. So it's a little nervy in doing that. One incident that happened that's of note is Wyatt was called to tone down a cattleman, a rich cattleman who was important to the town, who was out in the street shooting. So Wyatt went out, disarmed him, dragged him to jail. And one of the lead councilmen in town ran after him and said, Wyatt, wait a minute, this is a very important man. You can't put him in jail. Wyatt dragged him into the city offices, and the councilman followed and just would not let Wyatt close the door, so Wyatt threw him in too. He threw both men into jail. Wyatt felt like he made a lifelong enemy that day. He felt like he was just doing his job. But he felt like that this man, Bob Wright, held a grudge on it and hired someone to humiliate Wyatt. This man, who was very well known around the West at that time as a killer and gunman. He's the one who fashioned himself, when someone asked his occupation, I'm a shootist. That may have been the first time the word got public. Clay Allison came into town to debase all of the Dodge City police force. It's the same story. Wyatt with some men to back him up at a distance. Wyatt's the one to walk in and be the spokesperson. The outcome of that is that in a few moments, Allison is on his horse riding out of town. The most important thing, I believe, that happened for Wyatt Earp during his Dodge City days is meeting this man. They didn't meet in Dodge City. Wyatt, on the off season from the cattle business, Wyatt went south to Texas working for the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad as a detective looking for train robbers. Wyatt was a strong believer in using confidential informers. And that's what he was doing when he met Doc Holliday. Holliday gambled with everybody, including all the Texans around there who had just come back from up north. And he thought Holliday might be able to give him some information. The reason he knew all this is, guess who was running this bar down in Fort Griffin, Texas? Wyatt's old boxing manager, John Chauncey. And Chauncey told him about Holiday. So Wyatt goes over, introduces himself, and something happens here that's very interesting. He gets no information from Doc. Doc doesn't have any to give him. But what happens is that I believe Holiday is truly, what's the word I should use here? He's just engaged by Wyatt Earp's character and demeanor. There's something about Wyatt that I think Holiday just admires right away. And it's not reciprocated. Wyatt doesn't think much at all about Holiday. Wyatt comes back and he takes over his duties in Dodge City. Holiday and his paramour, Kate, show up. They live in Dodge City then. Doc sets up a dental practice. But he's also gambling because he's got that cough and his business is not doing so well. And he loves gambling anyway. That's his thing. One night, during a disturbance in a saloon, Wyatt is called down to take care of it. And he is outfoxed by the men in there. And he finds himself looking at the muzzles of plenty of guns. And there are Texans in there who hold grudges against him. It looks like it's all over for Wyatt Earp. Out of the blue, Doc Holiday steps in with 2 pistols. I don't think so, gentlemen. And in that moment when he catches everybody's attention, Wyatt's gun is out, and now this situation goes no farther. Men go to jail. Wyatt Earp's life was saved by Doc Holiday that night. He always said that Doc saved his life, and he never forgot it. Remember that loyalty he showed to John Flood for writing his story? He was loyal to Doc Holiday. And it was one of the most damaging friendships he could have had. Because remember, Wyatt wanted to raise himself up in society. And it would be Doc often who was the anchor that kept him down. Moving on to Tombstone, the Great Silver Strike. And now, Wyatt wants this to be the real pivot in his life. Lay down the guns. Get into business. Be a businessman. Be respected. The Silver Strike here is just open to all kinds of things. And what he wants to do is to create a new stage line to carry both passengers and bullion. He even buys a sturdy wagon that he will convert later with the help of a carpenter into a stagecoach. He brings all the horses that he'll need. And when he gets here, he finds out that the market for express deliveries is just glutted. There's no room. They're already having price wars here. So he has to throw that away, that idea away. What's he going to do? Well, he dabbles in things like, certain mining rights and water rights and real estate, that kind of thing. But then he falls back into what he probably does best, which is working with the law. And once again, he's approached by the county sheriff. The county sheriff is in Tucson, and he needs, Pima County once included Tombstone. It was a huge county before Cochise was cut out of it. So the sheriff needed a good man down here to simply serve as sheriff here in this town. He was a deputy sheriff. And what was already in place here was a formidable group of outlaws who had been run out of Texas by the Rangers, and then who had drifted over even further from New Mexico. Some of them had served in the Lincoln County War. They were very seasoned killers. And they had formed this loose-knit gang that we now they called then the Cowboys. That word at that time meant that you were a rustler and a desperate man, a potential killer. So this was more or less the scene that Wyatt dropped into when he became a lawman. So he's got this huge, it's almost like a very disorganized mafia in a way. So this is the Clantons and Johnny Ringo and Joe Hill and Pony Deal. You know, it goes on and on. The numbers of this vary. So I don't know that I can even guess a number, but it's a good many that are out there. And from time to time, they band together and take part in a crime, stagecoach robberies, murders, even lots of cattle theft and horse theft, and that went both ways across the border. Taking American cattle to sell to Mexicans, taking Mexican cattle and selling to Americans. How did all this work into the so-called OK Corral fight? Have you ever noticed that the movies never explain to you why the fight happens? It just all of a sudden, there it is, because people kind of don't like each other. It was all about undercover work. Wyatt made what I think was one of his worst decisions in deciding to do some undercover work with Ike Clanton. Ike Clanton was too loud a person to do that, in my opinion. But he wanted Clanton to betray his men and to set it up where Wyatt could capture these three men who had tried to rob a stagecoach and had killed the driver, popular man, and had killed a passenger. So it was a big deal in the town when this happened. And Wyatt knew that a new county was going to be was being cut out of Pima, and he wanted to be the sheriff. So he told these guys, all I want is the glory. I want to be elected sheriff. You get all the reward money. And it just imploded. It just didn't work. And so Clanton got panicked and believed that he was going to be found out. And he began getting very vocal about it, about how the Earps were saying things about him. The Earps never said anything about him. Wyatt Earp kept his word with Clanton. But Clanton got so loud about it that it just funneled right into this. This is a painting by Andy Thomas. After this fight, which you can say the Earps came out on top, even though wounded, the cowboys would take new approaches. Let me tell you about some statements that were said about Wyatt Earp during the fight. This was in the epitaph, a quote from a witness. Wyatt Earp stood up and fired in rapid succession, as cool as a cucumber, and was not hit. Fred Dodge, a Wells Fargo undercover man, said, as Wyatt tended to his brothers who were wounded, Morgan and Virgil, Wyatt was cool and collected, as usual. During the fight, I think this is the most amazing one. Wyatt Earp said to Ike Clanton, who had rushed Wyatt, grabbed onto him, I think most men would have shot him, shot Ike. What did Wyatt do? He threw him away and said, "This fight is commenced. Go to fighting or get away." What kind of collected mind? So now the cowboys are going at the Earps in the dark and at the back, ambushes. And it happened here around this intersection where we spent some time this morning. Virgil was shot crossing the street in December of '81, and then a few shops down the road, Morgan was killed in the Hatch's billiards parlor, shot in the back. He died that night. Morgan is said to be Wyatt's favorite brother. This kicked off the vendetta ride. Virgil had already been a United States deputy marshal, and so Wyatt sent a cable. They're the two brothers who were shot. Wyatt sent a cable to Crawley Dake, the U.S. Marshal, and the cable did not say, "Would you appoint me deputy marshal in Virgil's place?" The cable said, "Appoint me deputy marshal. Virgil's been shot." So Wyatt wears this badge now, and though he wears the badge, and it appears that he's going about this legally. He's not. He has no intention to arrest. His purpose is to kill. And here's one of the things that I believe influenced him. Wyatt was never able to get a cowboy found guilty in court in Tombstone. If you were a cowboy and you committed a crime and you were pulled in, let's say you were accused of knocking over a store in Bisbee, well, 3 cowboy friends of yours would come in and perjure themselves and swear that you were at contention at that time. Couldn't have done that. So nobody went to jail. But Judge William Stilwell called Wyatt up to his bench one time after a case and said, "Wyatt, I think maybe you better start leaving your prisoners out in the brush and let the coyotes deliberate over them." So Wyatt goes on the vendetta ride, and I believe this is what makes us admire him more than any other thing. Even though he's now an outlaw, and 2 posses are chasing him, while his posse is chasing the people who were responsible for his brothers. All of this, as a child, I believed was constant demonstrations of courage. But I was wrong. I was too young to take literally what Bat Masterson had told me, and what Jimmy Cairns had told me, and what Bill Tillman had told me, all through print. Bat said, Wyatt Earp was one of the few men I knew in the West whom I considered to be absolutely devoid of physical fear. I never got that. I saw that as courage. It's not the same thing. To show courage, you have to overcome fear. To be fearless, you don't have to do that. It's just the way you are. It's a mindset that might be hard to grasp for most of us. But that's what enabled Wyatt Earp to have that kind of confidence. All these men said the same thing. And when Wyatt was in his 60s, Arthur King wrote this about him, that Wyatt was asked by the chief of police of Los Angeles to go into Mexico undercover and bring back prisoners who had escaped without having to go through all the pains of extradition. And they sent this deputy with him. Look what he said about Wyatt. I would imagine that you see this in a person's eyes. And I would imagine that a lot of people saw it in these eyes. Thank you.